Hi! Alright, this is a video response to, I have my phone, so I'm going to use it for notes. This is a response to an excerpt called Who is Afraid of the Transracial Subject, Racial Linguistics and the Political Project of Transracialism by the linguist Samy Alim. And the section that I'm responding to is titled 9 Moments of Racial Translation Across 5 Language Varieties. So in this excerpt, Alim explains how he uses this argument he prefaces his argument by using a personal experience of how he, as a man of color, is able to give off this impression that he's all these different races, or people perceive him to be races. And now I know, to our understanding of race, we're like, oh, our phenotype is something that we can't change, that you are born with your race and that it's always a constant. But that's not necessarily the case, because despite Alim explaining where he is, and in this one example, he looks the same, but people perceive him differently. So the example that he has is when he's going to an airport, he's going to Europe, and on the first flight to France, this man assumed he was Algerian because Samy's name, or Samy Alim's name, the man thought that Samy was short for Osama, which is an Algerian name, and Alim was like, no, I'm not Algerian. So there's that notion of language, the name, like you think the name is associated with a certain race or background, a cultural identity. And another example he explains was how his race was assumed to be Latino because he spoke Spanish. And on another flight to Berlin, I think, he speaks Spanish with 2 women next to him, and when he says that he speaks in Spanish, one of the women turn to him and say, like, oh, are you Mexican? And he's like, no, I just know how to speak Spanish. And this presumption that, he is of a certain identity because he speaks a certain language. It's like, oh, then how do you speak it so fluently? Because if you're not from the culture, like, oh, how can you speak a language fluently? Without thinking too much about people who study languages outside, or study languages in an academic setting. So how does this experience speak to the way we understand the connection between language and race? And yeah, they're very interconnected. If you speak one language, you can be assumed to be of a certain race, and vice versa. If you are of one race, you can be assumed to speak a certain language. My experience personally, this transracialism is actually quite, it's pretty diverse, and I think speaking as a Latina, specifically an American-born Latina, born to Peruvian parents, there's a lot of ethnic ambiguity in Latinos, and specifically also for the fact that the Latino race isn't really a race. Well, that's arguable. There are papers of Latino intellectuals and writers that they describe this la raza cosmética, or la raza cosma? No, cosmética. La raza cósmica. However, because Latinos, well, the main races we're talking about here are Black, White, Asian, and Native. And Latinos are a product of this historical, the historical maladies of colonization and the conquistadors, that, saying someone who's from Central America isn't really saying like someone's from South America. There are very intricate differences between, what we understand as Latin America as a whole. Same with the assumptions like, oh, if you speak Spanish, you're Mexican. It's not always the case. As in my case, it really depends on where you are, the situation at hand. From mi rostro, I am fair-skinned. You know, my hair is not dark. I mean, it's dark, but it's not, you know, a very dark brown. You know, some people would say that I look white. However, I would not say that I'm white passing, because when I'm in a white community, when I spend time in, there's very like Eurocentric features, then it's very clear to people when they see me, they're like, oh, what are you? They assume if I'm not white that there's something else mixed in there, because I think white is very surface level of like skin, but it's like, well, if you're white, black, or brown, like there is different, obviously there are different connotations. So it's clear that I'm not white passing, but to some people of color, I guess they would attribute more to my whiteness in the way that I speak, in the way that I am, or the way that I carry myself, especially to Latinos. And I'm talking about Latinos that are in Latin America. So a few years ago I went to Peru, and while I was there, my mother always joked, and she was like, oh, like, you're very gringa, like everyone knows that you're not from here. Like everyone knows that you're not Peruvian. They know that you're American. But when did American become synonymous with white? It's like a matter of language too, because the minute that I speak, they know that I was like, oh, she's not from here. And especially in the Latino community, it's very, I feel that it's very cutthroat, that, you know, there's a degree of skepticism to your Latino-ness, depending on how much Spanish you speak. You know, I think it's actually funny that a couple of days ago I was taking the bus to get to school, and this woman was standing by the bus stop, and she looked a little bit, you know, a little bit confused. There were other people around her, but I walked by her and we made eye contact. And then as we were boarding the bus, she, you know, came up to me and immediately started speaking in Spanish. She was like, oh, ¿cómo puedo ir a Jamaica? ¿Qué autobús no tengo que tomar? And I responded to her in Spanish, like, oh, necesitas cruzar la pista para tomar el Q17 para ir a Jamaica. And I thought it was interesting because she looked at me and just somehow assumed that I knew Spanish, which I guess is, like, it's true, but, you know, it's not always like that. Yeah. And in terms of race as well, I think when people try to identify your race, I don't ever see it as a bad thing. It's very personal too. Like, I'm very indifferent to what I'm, no, that's not true. I'd say I'm indifferent to what I'm perceived as, but there's a multitude of things people have considered me to be that, I guess, under the umbrella of being Latino or Latina, it's just something that comes with being of a very mixed historical background. Specifically when we're talking about natives as well, because, you know, in historical context, main difference between North Native Americans, and South Native Americans is that the North basically wiped out. There was no intermingling of the races, but in Latin America there was. There was a very strict class system that was very dependent on how white you were, because, you know, the Spaniards came and they intermingled with the natives. Yeah. So it is a very broad statement, because in the same scope, I have Puerto Rican friends and Dominican friends and El Salvadorian friends who, you know, they look nothing alike each other and they don't look like me, but we're all still categorized as Latino or Latina. But what is the essence of Latino? You know, my name could be for one, you know, Adriana Taboada. I think that's it's a name that it's not as it's not as obvious as a name, say something like Maria Vasquez or Manuel Lopez. Like, those are very, like, to our understanding just in the media and, you know, how everything is portrayed to us, we understand those last names to be Hispanic, Latino, you know, ending with easy, Fernandez, Lopez, Vasquez. But then there's other Spanish last names that aren't as well known, and it's the case with my last name, Taboada, which is from Spain. And people look at it and they're like, don't really know what that is. Same with Adriana. In America, people say Adriana. My Spanish says Adriana. I say Adriana to, like, simplify it, not the so if someone reads my name and say Adriana Taboada, they know it's like, oh, this seems to be a semi-Latin name, maybe not as obvious as someone else, but it is so. And, you know, growing up, there is such a diversity of features. It's interesting, for example, my sister, who, you know, we share the same parents, we're both born to Peruvian parents. My sister, because of her name, people assumed her to be Italian. At the same time, her, you know, her face is different from mine, but in subtle ways that, you know, we look related, but it denotes like an entirely different race, I suppose. I've gotten different ones like Filipina or Chinese even. I've gotten like a mix of white and Chinese. Also, someone says I looked Israeli, but obviously that's, you know, within someone's judgment, because, you know, I guess to someone, if I look Asian, I'd be like, oh, I guess that's your perception, because obviously I know myself not to be Asian. I have never lived an American Asian life. Like, I've only known Latin American customs in the United States. Yeah. So despite having, you know, full-blood relatives, we're all perceived as different things. I live in a neighborhood that's predominantly Asian, South Asian, but in the bordering neighborhoods there are, you know, big Latino communities, Greek communities, Italian communities, that, you know, if I go in there, they could probably recognize me as Latino or Latina. They would probably recognize me as Latina. And this idea of transracialism is very, it is circumstantial. Technically, we're not talking about actually changing our race, but race is something that's perceived. We'd say certain facial characteristics denote certain races, but then you can attribute that to your genetics. And so race really shouldn't have a look about it, but it ends up doing so. And it can be for social reasons as well. Why, you know, some people would like to avoid being claimed as a certain identity. For example, New Yorkers, so this big Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States back in the 70s that caused a lot of Puerto Ricans to move to New York. Still a very black and white time, so it's like if you're not black, then you're white, and if you're not white, then you're black. So there's a lot of ambiguity in there where you can't just peg someone as black or white. There's a lot of nuances to come into it, but because of certain discrimination policies and, you know, anti-black sentiments, and also, you know, white supremacy, anything that's not white, people will try to hold on to anything that will make their lives easier.